the sounds of the birds chirping, a little bit of movement in the leaves on the trees, just enough to notice when you look closely, and a silence that doesn't require you to speak loud to be heard. To me, that's yoga. And what I mean when I say all those things is that yoga is presence. Yoga is the complete involvement with exactly what it is that we're doing or meditating on. I like to think of enlightenment as a friend that's right here in the next seat available to us. Enlightenment, the Buddhists believe, is merely the absence of suffering. But the Buddhists first acknowledge that we must acknowledge this suffering in order to kind of move past it or accept it so much that it no longer is suffering in itself. I like to talk about suffering because it's the most universal thing that we can find. We all suffer in various ways. And if you don't suffer, then I suppose congratulations, you're enlightened. But that's not me. I suffer. And sometimes I suffer quite a bit because life is hard. And we face challenges that sometimes feel bigger than ourselves. It's said that suffering has its causes, and those causes tend to be the desires of the mind. The mind desires something, it doesn't get it, and so it suffers. And on a very small scale, this could just mean if your mind is craving a certain food, you don't have that food, and then since you don't have that food, you suffer. Again, on a much larger scale, this could be, desiring security for your family and losing a job. This could be losing a loved one that you were attached to because they were a loved one. And sometimes it's very human to form attachments. Something I'm recognizing while here in the mountains with good people around me is that it's not an isolated journey of freeing oneself from suffering and its causes. It's a communal journey. It's a journey that we move through directly with the people in our lives. Because whether we like it or not, our suffering affects the beings around us, just as our peace affects the beings around us. And their suffering affects us just as their peace affects us. It's all more connected than we think. Energy is cyclical and circular in that way. Time is cyclical and circular in that way, in that destruction is not the end, destruction is just the preface to creation. When we cease the fluctuations of the mind, the seer is able to abide in its own true nature. Our true self, which is the thread of consciousness that lives within us, is able to sit, recognize, and abide in its own nature instead of identifying with the mind. Because as we mentioned earlier, the mind is the source of suffering, because the mind is the desiring faculty in our heads. So maybe it's not how can I rid myself of desires, but how can I have desires that are more aligned with the true ultimate path of my spirit. And the desires of my true self are love and peace and connectedness and forgiveness and softness. We're on a journey not to destroy the ego, because the ego is part of us. The ego is kind of what makes us the unique human element that we are. But it's to reframe our relationship with the ego. I'm no longer living to serve the ego. I'm living to serve the spirit, and the ego is the passenger to that spirit that gets to add a human context to this spiritual journey. And it's kind of beautiful in that way. So how can I let my ego just be along for the ride instead of being that element that controls my actions and my desires, which then inform my suffering? A lot of it comes back to releasing one's own selfish desires. And I think what's important is to recognize that it's not a bad thing to be selfish. It's natural to be selfish. And sometimes the world rewards selfishness. A lot of times the world rewards selfishness. The more selfishness we have, often the more material success we have, often the more wealth we accumulate, often the more we feel like we are meeting our goals in this material realm. if we look at the truly selfless being, the truly selfless being is the ascetic or the sadhu, the one who completely renounces the material life in pursuit of a spiritual one. The one that says, I don't need any possessions. I release my bank accounts, I release the clothes off my back, I release this apartment that I'm living in. I release everything, and I have no possessions, and I will wander the world, and I will meditate, and I will seek higher consciousness. But we don't need to find that true renunciation, and we don't really need to find that true selflessness. There is a balance, there is a yin and yang, there is a harmony amongst our material and our spiritual lives. I see blue jays flying across the sky, it's so wonderful. How you spend your time is personal religion. The actions that you take are your personal religion. What am I going to do right now? I'm realizing at this stage in my life the importance of community and being amongst others. For a while I have worked hard to try to make the world a better place, but I've done a lot of that work myself in solitude. I've spent a lot of time lonely without knowing it, or maybe masking that loneliness in the title of an introvert. And the reality is, laughter is medicine, and laughter rarely happens alone. The reality is, other people are mirrors to ourselves, and it's hard to understand our own being and our own impact when it's not being mirrored back to us in a form of another human. The reality is, it's a whole lot easier to find joy and understanding and realization when we're among others than when we're doing it by ourselves. May we keep practicing. May we keep practicing in pursuit of understanding the truth of our own nature. May we keep practicing for the benefit of all beings in all times and spaces. May we keep practicing to expand our sphere into a realm of connection that can only exist when we really open our eyes.